Okay, everyone. Final video before first test. This was going to be on covering Quintilian very briefly, and then St. Augustine. And this is Sunday evening. I had a family birthday thing I had to go to. So I just got back. It's getting late. I want to do this as quick as I can. Different backdrop. I'm in our casita, which my wife turned into her business's conference room. So hopefully it's a better backdrop than our other spot. So we finished talking about Cicero last time, and following Cicero, the story is the decline of the Roman Republic, the spread of the empire, and therefore the decline of rhetoric as an important civic function. And nevertheless, it becomes a key part of the spread of the spread of Roman culture, and becomes part of just sort of the educational bureaucracy leading into the Middle Ages. So, a couple of the beats here is after Cicero. Quintilian is like a couple of generations after Cicero, very much in the Ciceronian and Isocratean tradition. But he's an educator, a theorist of pedagogy, or of how to train, how to educate. Sort of like Isocrates with the pedagogy theme. But as we'll see, he was deep into this. So Quintilian, and then, after that, Herrick talks a little about this thing, the second sophistic, which is sort of like how rhetoric became less about sort of political maneuvering and debate and argumentation and so on, and became more of this kind of performative display thing that was more about big crowds and theaters. So the sophistic part is just performing to mass audiences, right? And then St. Augustine comes, a couple generations after Quintilian. So, frankly, the rhetorical presence that we talked about with Cicero in Rome and its legacy starts to kind of dwindle in terms of practice. But throughout the Middle Ages, even going up, into the Renaissance when new things start to happen. But for hundreds of years, the only thing that kind of counted in terms of rhetorical theory, instruction, and so on was Cicero. De Inventione was huge, and basically just kind of going back and pulling out of these technical kind of skills. And then this thing that Herrick talks about in chapter 6, he talks about scholasticism, and it becomes this kind of sort of dead practice. It's just you just go back into these ancient texts, you find a passage, and you kind of chew on it, or you write things from it, or you compose speeches based on this. But it's not about training you to do this thing so much as kind of repeating an old dead language. Okay. Nevertheless, we want to briefly look at Quintilian and St. Augustine because they were important figures in terms of the legacies of these ideas, right? So, very briefly, Quintilian. There's not much in the Herrick book, but he actually wrote what is still, I think, the most substantial book, single kind of overarching book on rhetorical instruction that's ever been put down. It's called The Institutes of Oratory, De Oratory Institutione. Yeah, The Institutes of Oratory. It's basically what is involved in this massive endeavor to become an orator. And the goal of this work, as he says in the very beginning, is to cultivate. That word cultivate's important. It's about education. It's about training. It's about mentoring and development and so on. Cultivating the perfect orator, right? What is the thing that we would want, and this sort of ultimate achievement in terms of oratorical practice, and then how do we get there? And it's a cradle to grave, right? So he's literally thinking about the entire life of the orator, the way you might envision the life of Tiger Woods, golfer. When he was a little boy, he was on David Letterman putting. I don't know if you ever saw that old video footage. It's amazing. Like Tiger Woods was this total phenom, like when he was a little boy. And like his whole life, just practice, practice, practice. How do you get better? How do you take a little Tiger Woods and turn him into, the Tiger Woods that, well, before he flamed out, whatever. Anyway, so the cradle to grave approach to creating the perfect ultimate orator is what this thing is all about. And he wrote it in 12 volumes. And when I talk of volume, I mean like each volume is a book, right? So 12 separate books in one book. One summer I was tasked with reading through this by Tom Conley. He just sort of challenged me. He's like, if you haven't gone through Quintilian yet, you should. So I went to the library and I got all these old books out and I just kind of like plowed through them. And I didn't go super detailed through it, but I got a pretty good sense of what he's doing. And it's a lot like Cicero, actually, in the De Oratore. It's extremely just super detailed. And in terms of like conceptual innovations, there's nothing that's really different or new, building off of like, we've got Aristotle and all of his ideas about invention and so on. And then there's Hermagoras and stasis theory, which we talked about last time. And so basically it's like more or less those kind of major schemes are in there. They're just like really, really thought through, right? And so the entire canon's in there: invention, arrangement, memory, delivery, style. It's all covered. Nothing really, really new, okay? But there's one thing that we do want to note about Quintilian. First of all, the education pedagogy theme is really important. It's like training from the get-go. Like, what do we need to know? What age should he be reading astrology or astronomy? At what age should he be reading the poets and the philosophers? And who should he read? And like for how long? And what kinds of practices and instructions and so on? It's really something what he was attempting there. The thing that I like to focus on when I'm talking about Quintilian is book 12 or the last volume of the book is sort of like, okay, now we've been talking about all this stuff, like what's the most important thing? What are we up to here? What are we looking for? And he starts talking about the connection between good speaking, eloquence, and virtue. So you might have heard the definition of rhetoric that it is the good man skilled in speaking. It's not Quintilian's own. He gets it from Cato the Elder, but he invokes it in his last volume. He says, the ultimate orator is the good man skilled in speaking. That's it, right? And so what is skilled in speaking? That's eloquence, right? That's about delivery. That's about style. And it's about all those other things that we know about in terms of kairos and knowing what to say and when to say it. And think about Isocrates and that video on Isocrates and the whole business of like using your imagination and your training and so on to like be able to respond in a moment on the fly, being adaptive and so on, knowing your subject really well, knowing your audience, reading a room, and like it's a lot. It's a high wire act, right? So that's the skilled in speaking part. But what about the good man part? That's really important. This is taking us back to Plato and his whole discussion about like what is it that rhetoric does? What does it teach? What does it communicate? Or is it just sensation and gratification, right? So Plato was the one who's really interested in like the character of the people involved here. For Aristotle, that's just a matter of ethos, but for Plato, it's about your soul. Don't forget that whole business about the soul, right? So here we're kind of back in a little bit of like that Platonic territory with questions about morality and goodness and so on. And it's quite a remarkable argument that he makes, Quintilian, in this book, because he basically says that virtue and eloquence are the same thing. He says, essentially, you cannot be a good speaker if you're not already a good man. And if you're a good man, you are apt to be a good speaker. Right? It's similar to what we talked about in Isocrates, those two roads that you're pursuing, that kind of merge eventually. For Quintilian, if you're thinking about like this child that you're educating and training from very, very young age, and if you set him on the course of reading the right things and engaging in the right practices and sort of immersing in the world of knowledge in the right way, then the good character is going to come, and the eloquence and the good speaking are going to come as well. He just saw them as like synchronous or like enmeshed. And it's this lovely idea, it's this lovely argument, but, it's also like, I doubt it. Like we can think of good speakers who are not good people, and we can think of good people who are not good speakers. But for him, the ultimate achievement of rhetoric is, in fact, good man, skilled in speaking. So I just want to note that Quintilian's, it's very much indebted to Cicero, very much indebted to Isocrates. He's all about, the importance of invention and knowing your arguments and working through all that kind of stuff. And he's really all about that intersection of eloquence and wisdom, or eloquence and virtue. Yeah. So, all right. I guess I'll stop there. That's already 10 minutes. And so St. Augustine is chapter 6, Rhetoric in Christian Europe. So with the fall of the Roman Empire, we now have the rise of Christendom, and the spread of the Holy Roman Empire, I believe, right? So the Christian church becomes the next kind of major story in terms of the influence across Europe, and rhetoric's involvement in that was this kind of scholastic thing, right? It's just sort of like this old practice. The Christian church did not have a lot of, as Herrick notes, did not have a lot of trust in that old pagan practice, those old Greeks and Romans who were very lusty and, just kind of seedy, right? Pagan, worshipped all these weird gods. The Christian approach is very much like avoiding those sensuous practices and dynamics. Yep. So St. Augustine, page 136 here. He was born in North Africa, which was like a Roman outpost at the time. He apparently was trained in sort of like sophistic style rhetoric and actually became a very gifted, eloquent speaker in that kind of sophistic mode. And then had a conversion to Christianity at some point in his life, and really kind of pivoted, and was very much like kind of ensconced in his rhetorical training, and then used that training and that background and those skills to advance a study or a practice of Christian eloquence, right? And so this is interesting. It's the first time that we are thinking about rhetoric and Christianity, or any kind of like organized religion. We have, Plato's wild metaphysical realm that we were looking at, but this is more kind of familiar to us, right? And so the thing that we want to look at is his De Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine. So it's, sort of like Quintilian, like how Quintilian's like interested in how you create the perfect orator. St. Augustine's interested in how it is that the Christian orator fulfills his highest duty, right? And again, the themes are not too far from what we've seen coming from Isocrates through Cicero, through Quintilian. The terms that are key here are wisdom and eloquence, right? We saw that a lot in Cicero, right? So it was all that kind of, balancing of practice and skill with the right kind of knowledge and learning. Here, the virtue stuff is baked into the fact that he's interested in a Christian eloquence, right? So the main concerns, at least in the last book, I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about book 4. There's 3 books obviously before that, and then book 4 is the final kind of big payoff book, and that's where he's talking about, and I have a little selection on our website here, on Christian doctrine, selection from book 4. I just went through and found a few chapters, like maybe 8 or 9 different chapters where he's talking about key stuff that we're interested in. As Herrick notes here, the stuff that he is getting into in the first few books are on signs, right? So what's sort of 2 kind of main interesting things about St. Augustine and De Doctrina Christiana. The first one is this thing that we now today call hermeneutics, right? So pretty much for the first time ever, we're seeing an attempt in the first few books of this work, an attempt to theorize signification or semiotics, which is a theory of signs, right? And so he's talking about signs as distinct from things, right? Signs are something that represents something else, whereas a thing can just be itself. Like a rock is a thing. A sign, like a picture of a rock, is something that refers to a rock, right? Of course, a rock on its own can also remind you of things, but he wants to distinguish between signs and things. And then he gets into signs and talks about conventional signs and natural signs. And this is what he's doing in the first few books of this treatise on rhetoric, is a theory of signs, right? And so the point of this is proper interpretation of the scriptures. So if we're asking the question of St. Augustine, like what counts as invention, or what counts as his like source of knowledge and authority, it's the scriptures themselves, right? So having had this conversion to Christianity, he was a very ardent believer. And so for Augustine, all of the truth that one needs in terms of authority for making arguments are in the scriptures. So the challenge for the rhetor, the speaker, becomes how to get at those truths, how to come up with the right interpretation. Because as I'm sure we're well aware, there are many interpretations of different passages in the Bible, and they pro, are they con, do they support veganism, do they not support veganism, right? And so we can like pour over these passages, especially like the parables and the proverbs and all that kind of stuff. It's a very poetic work. I think especially more so even the New Testament. It's been a while since I've dug into it, but like there's a lot of poetics and mythology and imagery and, you know, how do you interpret that stuff? So it's a guide to interpretation to generate the best possible arguments, the strongest messages for the congregation, right? So it's a really fascinating sort of process of thinking through interpretation. And it's important to remember that like there is a truth in the Bible. It's a kind of singular truth. And to that extent, you can think about St. Augustine as sort of Platonic. Because he's a believer in this kind of transcendent, unified truth that you can find in the scriptures. It's up to us to properly interpret. Sort of in the same way as Plato would say, it's up to us to pursue knowledge at all costs, right? Remember the Phaedrus and the chariot and the search for love and knowledge and so on. So it's up to the diligent Christian orator to discover those truths. And because they're in there, right? It's not like the sophists would say, oh, anyone can find any truths and pull any truth out of the Bible, and it's all good, and do what you know, use whatever you want, and so on and so on. No. For St. Augustine, it is, right? So this is hermeneutics. You can think of invention as hermeneutics with St. Augustine. So what counts as invention? It's that discovery. That's interpretive discovery, right? So then the next part of that is, all right, you've got your truth, you've got your message. Now what do you do with it? And that's book 4, right? So book 4, it's him talking about sort of how the Christian orator delivers this message and sort of what are the settings that they should follow. And to just sort of blow the lid off this thing, getting back to Cicero, or Cicero was talking about wisdom and eloquence. For Augustine, it's very, very clear, right, that you need eloquence. You need it. You can't sort of touch an audience without it. But more important is wisdom, is getting the interpretation of scriptures right. And so when I was teaching this in class, I was trying to come up with examples of like you have this really powerful thing that you can wield at any moment, but it's also terrifying and could get you into trouble. And someone came up with vibranium from Black Panther. It's like, not bad, but it's not like it gets them in trouble so much as it's just very powerful and attractive and people would want it. I came up with the example of, I don't know if anyone watches Better Call Saul, which is the follow-up series to Breaking Bad, which I just love Better Call Saul. And Saul, the main character, when he was younger, he used to go by the name Slippin' Jimmy. He's a con artist. And the whole point of the show is that we have this guy who's basically a sophist by heart. In his heart, he's a sophist. He's a con man. He's always just kind of coming up with these arguments on the fly, and he's really good with words, and he's very convincing, and he can kind of get himself all these jams. He's a very conniving and clever person. But he's trying to kind of make it straight in the field of law. And meanwhile, he's got this brother who's very much almost like a Platonist, a very serious respecter of the law, and he's always disappointed in his brother. And so he's almost like wisdom, and Saul's Saul's his eventual name. Better Call Saul. Oh, crap. Sorry, spacing out. Slippin' Jimmy. Jimmy. Is that right? Yeah, Slippin' Jimmy. So his brother's like wisdom and Jimmy's like eloquence. And when eloquence unleashes himself, man, it's like devastating. It's quite a thing to behold in terms of the writing of the show and the performance. These scenes where he just sort of unleashes his sophistic eloquence and his brilliance, and he just like owns everyone. It's quite something. But in any case, that's sort of similar to what we're seeing here, is you have this kind of wisdom which keeps you straight, and it's following the law of the truth of scriptures. But eloquence is this really powerful thing, the special sauce that you can sort of deliver your message with a lot more punch and power and force, but you always got to be careful, right? So his basic point is you need eloquence, but it always has to work in the service of the wisdom, and the wisdom is the interpretation of scriptures as he's discussed. Yeah, so he says, chapter 5, toward the bottom, the front page there. Now a man speaks with more or less wisdom, just as he has made more or less progress in the knowledge of Scripture. So wisdom comes from knowledge of Scripture, getting it right. Next page, the bottom of that top paragraph, it says, and as we must often swallow wholesome bitters, so we must always avoid unwholesome sweets. But what is better than wholesome sweetness or sweet wholesomeness, right? So it's an interesting way of thinking about kind of the right kind of knowledge and how you can add the sweetness of eloquence. They kind of go together. It kind of reminds me of Quintilian a bit there. His whole point is that there's kind of a right eloquence and a wrong eloquence, right? The sophistic eloquence is an eloquence that's for itself, self-serving. Whereas the eloquence that he's talking about is about kind of the glorifying of this transcendent order, right, or God that he would say, and so when you're sort of caught by that spirit or that truth or whatever, then the wisdom and the eloquence kind of line up. But anything else that's straying from that kind of connection is to be like distrusted, right? Because it's for your own glory, your own ego, your own edification. Let's see, the bottom of chapter 13. Says, the eloquent divine, then, when he is urging a practical truth, must not only teach so as to give instruction and please so as to keep up the attention with eloquence, but he must also sway the mind so as to subdue the will. For if a man be not moved by the force of truth, though it is demonstrated to his own confession and clothed in beauty of style, nothing remains but to subdue him by the power of eloquence, right? So it's like, if he doesn't get the message on its own merits, and a lot of audiences might not, a lot of people sitting in those chairs and in those pews or whatever, just kind of like fading out or whatever, that's when you got to go like, and I say, right, or whatever. And so it's like, again, it's this necessary instrument of like instant power, basically. All right, so that's kind of it, really. So the last page, 28, the bottom, it says, so men who teach lies are the more pitiable if they happen to be eloquent in speech. To speak eloquently, then, and wisely as well, is just to express truths which it is expedient to teach in fit and proper words. Words which in the subdued style are adequate, in the temperate style elegant, in the majestic style forcible. He's talked about these different kinds of styles, different registers, low, medium, high, basically. But the man who cannot speak both eloquently and wisely should speak wisely without eloquence, rather than eloquently without wisdom. So there you go. He's like laying all of his kind of priorities on the table there. It's more important to know the truth, to get the truth, to have the truth, and to convey the truth on its own terms. Eloquence is just like that extra bit of gas, that Jimmy sauce, you know? And that's about all I have for this last video and this last chunk. It's plenty long already. So that's it, gang. St. Augustine's really interesting because with him we see, so we've now established the four main models with Isocrates and Cicero kind of capping off that last one. So after that, that's it in terms of like the major coordinates of rhetorical practice and the different kinds of configurations here. And so then it becomes a matter of kind of plotting each new kind of major work on rhetoric within these traditions. And right off the bat here we have something that has elements of Plato, because the truth of Scripture, that transcendent truth is in the Scriptures. Our job is to get at it using hermeneutics and understanding of interpretation, or understanding of signs and so on. But then there's also this kind of Ciceronian component in terms of the eloquence, right? And so it's like, interesting. We can see a little bit of this one, and we can see a little bit of this one in there too. And so that's why hopefully the models are helpful, is because you can kind of see the themes and the tendencies, and sometimes it's all of one, or sometimes it could be two. And I find that quite interesting, frankly. So that's it in terms of the content for our first chunk of this class leading into our first test. And good luck with the studying. Like I said, I'm available for questions online, phone calls and such. And got to get back to grading. So have good evenings, everyone.